Hello, all. Thank you so much for coming to the meeting today to talk about tax credits with Brian Beadles, our Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. And I will let him take it away from here.
All right, yeah, thank you, everybody. We're going to talk about the historic tax credit program, and part of that discussion, since one of the requirements of the historic preservation tax credits is that projects will meet the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. I'll also talk about those standards. So I'm just going to jump right in if I can. There we go. And this will be kind of like a short version. There's it can be kind of a complex program, but in short, the historic rehabilitation tax credit, it's a joint program that is monitored and run by different entities. So the State Historic Preservation Office, we're involved basically in the initial gathering of application materials and consultation with local stakeholders. And then the National Park Service, through their technical preservation services, runs the program on the federal level. So they're the ones that actually officially review application materials and give more guidance on a national level as well. And of course, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, is a big part of the program, as there are specific tax laws that regulate tax credits. So the IRS gives guidance on the tax side of things. I personally don't give tax advice. I can talk more about the requirements of the program in terms of what can be done with the buildings and the paperwork part of it. But I always refer people to the IRS if they have specific tax questions. All right, there we go. So what the tax credit is that if a property owner is doing a rehabilitation of their property, they can potentially claim 20% of what their costs are for the rehabilitation as a credit on their federal income taxes. So not all of the costs on a rehabilitation project are part of the tax credit. So there are what's called the qualified rehabilitation expenses, and it's those qualified rehabilitation expenses that are used to calculate what the value of the tax credit is. And there is a three-part application process that is part of this. The process should be started. The application, at least the part one, the part two application, should be started before the project starts. We have had some exceptions to that, but we always recommend that the part one and the part two applications begin before the project begins. And I'll talk more about these as we go. So we talk about what are the qualified rehabilitation expenses. So those expenses that are used to calculate the value of the tax credit. It's your basic construction costs. So it's any kind of construction costs that are used to improve or make changes to the building within the building footprint. If you're doing work outside the building footprint, like you're improving a parking lot or you're doing landscaping, anything outside the building footprint does not count as a rehabilitation cost. But anything within the project footprint and anything that is considered a permanent part of the building. So again, furniture and that sort of thing would not count. But anything within the project footprint or within the building footprint, that's a permanent part of the building. You can also include some financing, so financing and loan fees and interest that take place during the rehabilitation construction period, property taxes during your construction period. If you're working with an engineering firm or an architecture firm, their fees count as allowable costs, as do any fees from a builder or a developer, or appraisal fees for the building. Costs that are not included. So if you're just purchasing a building, the initial building acquisition costs do not count. And kind of intangible things such as accounting fees, marketing, and things like that that are more intangible. Outside kinds of expenses don't count. And like I said before, anything that's outside the building footprint does not count. So to qualify for the 20% credit, there's a few things that need to be in place for a building to qualify, for a project to qualify for the tax credit. The first is that the building has to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. So it can be listed as an individual building within the National Register, or if it's within a historic district, it'd have to be a contributing element to an existing historic district. If someone has a building that is not listed and they're interested in the tax credit, we can still have a conversation about that, but we would have to get the building listed before they are able to claim the credit. And so in that case, if someone wants to do a project and the building's not listed, we could work with them to do the paperwork for the tax credit, but then they would also be responsible for doing the paperwork to get the building listed. And then we would have to have that listing by the time they claim the credit at the end of the construction period. Second, the property must be used for an income producing purpose. So it can be retail, it can be offices, industrial, it can be rental housing. Where it gets a little bit confusing and we start to kind of get into where the IRS has some opinions on things is where you have a case like a bed and breakfast where it's a combination of a building that is being used maybe for a residence and also for an income producing purpose. So if it's a bed and breakfast where the owner is also living in the building, that gets into a questionable territory, and I would refer people to the IRS. It's the same thing with like a home office or something like that, or a work from home kind of thing where somebody is claiming a building that they're using as a residence is also as a place for income producing. That gets into a really gray area where we refer people to the IRS to get a decision on whether they would qualify. Third, the rehabilitation must meet the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. And I'll go through each of these standards. There's a list of 10 standards for rehabilitation. And this is a requirement on from the National Park Service. And it's basically to ensure that these rehabilitations are going to respect the historic character, the historic materials of the particular building within the project. And as much as I would like to say that our office gets to have kind of judgment on whether something meets these standards, we act in kind of an advisory role with a project proponent and the owner to give our opinion on whether something meets these standards. But the final determination of whether a project is going to meet those standards falls to the National Park Service. The fourth item is that the property must meet the substantial rehabilitation test. So what this means is that there is a minimum amount of money a person has to spend on the rehabilitation project in order for it to qualify for the credit. And what it is basically, if you're well-versed in tax law, it's known as the adjusted basis of the building. So what that means is you take what the current value of the overall property is, you subtract out the value of the land. And if a person has owned the property for a while and they've been depreciating the value of it on their taxes, you subtract out any of that depreciation. And basically the value that's left is known as the adjusted basis of the building. So if you're in a situation where you're in an area like Teton County where in many instances the value of the land outpaces the value of the building, this number can be very low. In some other areas where it's a larger building and the land value is fairly low, this can be a high number. So what the minimum amount you have to spend is very dependent on the building, and what its situation is in its valuation. If somebody is not sure of the adjusted basis, they usually will have to work with an appraiser in order to figure out what these valuations are for their building, or they can work with their tax professional to figure out this valuation and what the adjusted basis is. And then, like I said, that becomes the minimum amount that you have to spend on the rehabilitation project. And depending on whether you're going to do your project as one phase, or if you're going to do it in multiple phases, there's a different amount of time in which you have to spend that money. So if you're doing everything in one big phase, then you have 24 months to spend that amount of money on your rehabilitation project. If you're doing multiple phases, then you have 60 months to spend that amount of money to claim the credit. And then finally, the credit must be claimed over a 5-year period following the completion of the rehabilitation project. So this means once the project is over, you're allowed to start claiming the credit, but you can't claim the full amount right away. So let's say your credit is valued at, say, $500,000, which would be a really large project. The most you can claim in year 1 after the rehabilitation is done is $100,000, and the same in year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. If you're in a situation where you don't want to or can't claim that full $100,000 in year 1, you can carry out how long you're claiming it up to 20 years. So if you only want to do, say, $20,000 or $5,000 in year 1, yeah, you can string that out how long you're claiming that credit, up to 20 years. So there is a part 3 or a 3-part application process. The part 1 just certifies that the building is historic. So this speaks back to that the requirement that the building has to be listed in the National Register. So the part 1, if a building is already listed, this becomes really easy. We can take language from the National Register listing and put it in here. And basically all this asks for is physical description of the building, and then some of the history. So if something's already listed, we can take that from the National Register nomination. If something is within a historic district, this certifies that it's in that historic district. And again, it's contributing element to that historic district. And we just list out some items from the physical description and also some of the history of the building. And we can generally help with this part of the application. If something is not yet listed, we can put in a part 1 application. This part 1 application would then become a little bit longer because we'll have to give the Park Service some more information to basically make the claim that the building is eligible to be listed. And basically this makes the statement that the building, that the property owner will then take the steps to get it listed. So again, we would do a more formal description of the building, and we probably want a little bit more information on the history of the building so that we can make a good, strong case that the property is eligible and that we would be able to get it listed at the end of the rehabilitation process. The part 2 application, this is the main part of the application form. So what this does is on this application is the property owner is basically describing every single thing they're going to do to the building during the rehabilitation of it. It's also at this point that the property owner has to basically make a declaration of whether they're doing this in one phase or multiple phases, so that we know if it's going to be a 24-month period or if it's going to be a 60-month period that they're going to be looking to spend the money on the project. And if you're doing it in multiple phases on this, you have to define what those phases are. So if exterior work is phase 1 and interior work is phase 2, we would have to delineate that on this application. But like I said, this application can be fairly long, and it's more complex projects that have more things that are happening to a building. This can be a fairly lengthy application. Because like I said, our office can do an advisory role when it comes to the Part 2 application and an advisory role on making sure the project is going to meet the standards of rehabilitation. But in the end, this application, this Part 2 application, is going to go to a person that reviews tax credit applications in this part of the country, but that person lives in Washington, D.C. So they're not going to come out to the building. They're not going to see it in person. So all the information that they need to make a judgment call on whether something is going to meet the rehabilitation standards all has to come out of this application. So this will include text within the application that describes what's going to be done. This is going to include photographs that show areas of the building that are going to be worked on. If it's needed, it would include also floor plans and building design plans, maybe demolition plans, depending on the scope of the project, that also show and enumerate out what exactly is going to happen to this building. And then we kind of, like I said, work in an advisory role, make sure all the information is complete, help the property owner if there's any questions on whether something may or may not be approved by the Park Service. And I think on this application, on this part, the more information that can be put into it, the better, to kind of help with that review on the federal level. Then once the Part 2 is submitted and hopefully approved, that's generally when work on the rehabilitation work, the construction work on the building will begin. So generally that's a time where just the construction is going. There's no other applications that are going until the project is completed. So the Part 3 application is once all the construction work is completed. The Part 3 is just certifying that the work that was done and enumerated, or the work that was completed, is the same as what was enumerated out in that Part 2 application. So all this is basically we certify who the owner of the building is, and then it's accompanied by all the after photographs that show all the completed work, so that the Park Service can see that what actually happened to the building is what was laid out in the Part 2 application. And then once the Part 3 application is completed and the building is then placed into use, at that point the property owner can begin to claim their credit. So again, for taking the credit cannot be taken until all the work is completed and the building is placed into service. Credit is taken using IRS Form 3468, and what that form is going to ask for are the beginning and ending dates of the construction era of the construction process. So they're looking to see if to make sure that the work is being done within that 24 or 60-month period. I have to report what that adjusted basis is so they can certify that the property owner spent over the minimum amount of money that was required, and a copy of the Park Service certification on the Part 3 application. So that Part 3 application, when it's approved, it's signed by the Park Service. A copy of that is sent both to the property owner and to the IRS, and just a copy of that has to be sent to the IRS, also by the property owner with their taxes, to certify that all the requirements of the Park Service have been completed. All right, now we'll talk about more fun stuff, because we actually get to look at pictures of buildings instead of talking about taxes and numbers. So like I said, any kind of project using the tax credits has to follow the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. The National Park Service actually publishes 4 different kinds of historic treatment standards: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. But rehabilitation is what we're focusing on here, and these are the standards that I'll be talking about. So the first standard is that in reusing a building, that the reuse has to be something that's an appropriate use for that particular building. it kind of lends to the idea that not every use is appropriate for every type of building out there. So the picture on the left is, it's basically a storage building. Its main characteristics are its kind of industrial feel, and these big blank walls that have, no windows on them. So what was actually put out there as a possible reuse for this building at one time was to turn it into residential lofts. But doing residential, you need to have interior light coming in. So the project proponent for this one wanted to bring in that natural light with, a series of windows on this elevation of the building. And the response is that, putting in all those windows would really change the character of the building. And the thought was, residential really isn't going to work for this building, because trying to get that much natural light into it wasn't going to be possible while still remaining, keeping that industrial kind of feel for the building. The second standard is a retention of the historic character of the building. So it goes beyond, keeping historic materials, but looking to like the broader scope of, are we retaining the historic character of the building and the historic feel of the building? So in this case, the case tried to be made that by running this exhaust pipe the way they did, they really didn't disturb any of the historic materials of the building, because they went out, an existing window. So they changed that window, but they didn't get into the brick. They didn't get into any of the trim. So they didn't really get into any of the materials, but it really obviously changes the character and how we view and visually interact with this building. So that second standard is more about that, keeping that historic character and feeling of the building. Third is recognition of time and place and use. So we want to avoid creating a false sense of historic development of the building. So that there was a time where it was a popular thing on historic buildings to kind of take a historic building and make it look like basically a thought we have of what kind of style it should be. So in a lot of areas that meant making things look colonial revival that never were colonial revival in their style. So that this is a prime example of that, of, trying to put on a different kind of historic style into this building that it never would have had. So we want to avoid that sort of thing. We also want to avoid, putting materials on there that maybe look old, but don't really match with the particular building. So we just need to make sure that when we make changes to a building, we're not trying to change the style of it. We're not trying to change the historic era that would have come from. And then number 4 is knowing that a lot of buildings have changed over time, and that sometimes those changes over time are now part of the historic character and fabric of a building. So this building in this example is the top left picture is what this originally looked like. It was a house that was located on the edge of a downtown area within its city. As the city grew and the downtown grew, it changed to become a storefront. So the second picture on the top shows that a storefront was added into the building, and this became part of the downtown. Over time, the configuration of that storefront changed a little bit. But again, it's this change from a purely residential to now a mix of residential and commercial was something that took place fairly early in this building's development. So that now when there was a chance to rehabilitate this building, a question was asked of whether they could take it back to that initial appearance when it was just a residential building. And the answer was no, that would not follow the standards, because this change from being purely residential to a mix of residential and commercial within the building was an important part of the development of the building and an important part of the development and expansion of this town. So that they were not able to fully take out that storefront, but rather had to rehabilitate that storefront and work it into their plans. We see this more and more in some of our downtown areas, as we see these mid-century changes that have happened to our downtown. So this is downtown Casper. And when the National Register nomination for downtown Casper was written, it was written in so that some of these modern, or we think of as modern, but some of these mid-century changes that were made to buildings they were done in the 50s, 60s. So they're done, believe it or not, 60, 70 years ago sometimes. So we're now looking at those as being a historic part of those buildings. So in this picture, for example, what's on there, the Charlie T Pizzeria, that alteration to the upper level was done early enough that is now in the National Register nomination, that is now considered an historic part of that building. So if they were to rehab that building and try and take off that material off the top floor, that would not follow this standard of looking at how the building has evolved over time historically. Standard number 5 is preserving those distinct features, finishes, and construction techniques and craftsmanship. So in starting any kind of rehab project, we recommend going through and looking at, what are those important character defining features of the particular building? What are those kind of special materials? What's the special craftsmanship that's in that building that really needs to be preserved? So this is Trail End up in Sheridan. It has a lot of really amazing woodwork in there. So any kind of project in there would have to protect that woodwork, would have to protect that craftsmanship that's throughout that building. We also see it in kind of more subtle ways. So this is a house up in Casper that the brickwork is this really specialized brickwork that gives an interesting texture and an interesting kind of design element to this building. So, trying to retain that brickwork as much as possible would be something that we want to do as part of any rehabilitation. Number 6, so it's the idea that we want to, as much as possible, retain the original components of the building. So in looking at parts of a building and those materials that are in disrepair, the first question should be, can we repair those elements? Can we repair those materials? If it is possible, then repair should always be the first thing that we look at. If it's just not possible to do a repair, if the material is too far gone, or components of the building are missing or can't be saved, then we will do a replacement. And if it does come to a replacement, then that replacement should be based on any kind of documentary evidence, such as historic photographs or descriptions, or lacking that, physical evidence itself from the building. Does the building show maybe a footprint of what a porch was, or does it show what the size and scope and materials of the windows should be? Like if you have a building that's boarded up, what those windows should look like, just based on physical evidence as well. So this is an example. This was a building that was a successful tax credit, and this is what it looked like before they started. And so you can tell that first floor, that storefront, is not historic to the building. It was a fairly modern addition to it. And so the project proponent and their architect started looking at what kind of plans for the storefront would be something they could do as part of rehabilitation. So to try and figure out some sort of design schematics, they started looking through to find historic photographs they could of this area. Whoops, wrong way. And so what they found was this image that they found in a publication that they were able to determine was an early image of this particular building. So they took this image and using this kind of documentary evidence, then did a design for a new storefront on the building. And this is what it looked like when they were done with their tax credit. So you'll see it's not a total reconstruction or a recreation of what that historic image was. There are some differences to it, but it's something that is taking from what was historically a part of this building and recreating it into something that fits within the modern use of the building. Standard number 7 is that if you're going to do any kind of cleaning of a building, a cleaning of a masonry or a brick building, you always want to use the gentlest treatment possible. So we always want to avoid sandblasting. That's something that can be really detrimental to a building. But yeah, we always want to try and find what is the gentlest way of doing it. And to help determine that, we usually recommend that number one, you have a good idea of what you're trying to accomplish. If you are going to do a cleaning of it, what exactly are you trying to get to? And sometimes a cleaning just, depending on the materials, it isn't necessary and shouldn't be done. But if there is a good goal in mind and the material can stand up to it, we would recommend usually doing a test patch, finding an inconspicuous spot on like a side or rear elevation, and just do a test patch with what you're proposing to use to do the cleaning, and see how it works with that particular material. Because we do have a lot of examples of areas that have really soft building materials. So in this picture, this is from F.E. Warren here in Cheyenne, and you can see the abrading on this brick, and this is actually just the result of the wind blowing sand and dirt and stuff up onto this building. It's a very exposed location. So if you can imagine the Wyoming wind doing this, then you can also imagine how something like a sandblasting or a very kind of aggressive cleaning treatment could really affect this kind of material. Standard number 8, which does not come up very often when we're doing building rehabilitations, but it's the protection of significant archaeological resources. So if you're doing some, say some foundation work and you're doing some ground disturbance and you come across, what looks like an archaeological site, we recommend, stopping, and you can call our office and we can take a look and see if it's something that needs to be avoided, or, come up with a solution that works for both the site and for the project. Standard number 9. So the last 2 standards, number 9 and 10, deal with additions to buildings. So even though an addition to a building would not count towards like a qualified rehabilitation expense, the design of the addition still has to be reviewed by the National Park Service. So that, number 9, the standard says that when there is an addition, it should be differentiated from the historic portion of the building, but also be a design that's compatible. So we don't want to do something that totally recreates the historic building, because we still want to be able to look at the building and look at the addition and be able to clearly differentiate what is the historic portion of the building and what is the addition. And having said that, the historic portion of the building should still visually read as the dominant portion of the building. So this is a great example that's up in Casper, where you can look at this picture and you can clearly see what is the historic portion of the building, what is the addition. The addition is set back. There's a little bit of a hyphenated kind of attachment into the building to the addition that kind of further sets back that connection between the addition and the building. And while the addition itself is fairly modern in its design, it basically used these bands of trim to kind of carry over some of those horizontal lines from the historic building, uses that arching of those windows and the canopy on the addition to help kind of, draw in also the arch design on the first floor of the historic building. So it's a really great way to have this modern addition that still respects the historic character of the original building. And then the last of the standards, standard number 10, is that any new construction, as much as possible, should be reversible, so that if you need to, at some point in the future, remove that new construction, we should be able to remove it and do as little damage as possible to the historic building. So this was the example of a accessibility ramp into a building out at F.E. Warren, and they were able to basically extend out the porch a little bit, and then run a ramp up onto that porch without really hitting into the building, so that in the future, if the access into this building changes and they need to reroute where this ramp is or change its location, they can remove this ramp and really have not done any damage to the historic building. And so I'm just going to end up with a quick case study that shows a building that successfully used the tax credit. So this is the Deneen building here in Cheyenne. It's currently, if you are familiar with downtown Cheyenne, this is the home of the Ribbon Chop House here. So the building on the right is a historic image of the building. It was originally used as a car dealership, and on the second floor they did service to the vehicles, and they also had a drive-through gas pump there on the front. The top picture on the left shows what it looked like before the tax credit started, and then the bottom on the left shows what it looked like after the tax credit, after their project was over. So you can see over time, from the historic to the beginning of the project, to the beginning of when the project was on, there had been some changes to the building. All the windows had been changed out. That drive-through gas pump that area had been filled in, is now like an interior space. And you can see on the facade on the left-hand side of the pictures that the size of some of those openings had changed. As vehicles got bigger, they had to expand out some of those openings. And so those were some of the changes that have been made over time. And then in doing the project, the big thing we see on the exterior is that they did come back with some new windows, so that did not have a historic window. So they, sorry, my phone keeps ringing. But they did the design of the new windows based off of what they were seeing in the historic photograph. And then for the new use of this as a restaurant and retail space, they did not want to have those really big openings on that left-hand facade or elevation. So they did some new designs over there to deal with those openings, shrank down the size of one of those openings to what they were historically in the photograph. And this shows that the elevation much better, where they really didn't want that one big opening there in the middle. So they were able to bring down that column, take this back to openings that are similar kind of size of what they're seeing in the historic photograph, but still make it work for a restaurant space. And then this is the interior of the second floor of that building. So again, we had the historic photograph that showed that this was basically an open space with exposed rafters, exposed brick through the interior. And that's what it was also at the beginning of this project. They were going to turn this into office space. So we had discussions on how to best do that, because they did want to enclose some of the space so they could have some conference room and some private offices. And they were able to do that while still keeping that character of open space on that, keep some of that character of the industrial use of it through keeping the exposed beams and exposed ductwork, and really, even though they were able to enclose some of the space and put down some carpeting, it still retains a lot of that openness and a lot of that industrial feel to it. So that is my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I can take some questions, or you can feel free to email or call anytime, and I can help you out if you have any specific questions or projects that you'd like to talk about.